We're excited about our session today here with Joe. I'm going to let you know a little bit about Joe. He graduated from the University of Wisconsin in 1964 and then Ohio State University in 1967 with degrees in engineering. And he began his career in 1967 in the aerospace industry, which at that time had a huge demand for technically skilled graduates. Joe's early assignment in 1968 was at NASA, Houston, on the team that programmed the Lunar Module Simulator, LMS, and the Lunar Landing Training Vehicle Simulator, the LLTVS, for Apollo 11. In 1970, he transferred to NASA Ames Research Center in Mountain View, California, to program helicopter and aircraft simulators. Due to NASA cutbacks, he changed his career path to commercial industry and finished his career at IBM in San Jose, California, where he worked on data storage and management products. Joe's wife, Neela, was also an IBMer, and they both are now retired from IBM. They live in Newport Coast, California, to be close to their daughter and her family. As an immigrant American from India, Joe is grateful and appreciative for the opportunity to contribute an iconic project like Apollo 11. So with that, Joe, it's all yours. Thank you for being here. We're excited.
Thank you, Krista, for that nice introduction. And thank you to the ECS organization for inviting me to speak at this webinar. I appreciate that. And thank you all in the audience for attending the webinar. And I hope that you find your time worthwhile and informative. So here's the agenda for my presentation. Before we get to the agenda, I'll just briefly mention that I was really fortunate to have the opportunity to contribute to this Apollo 11 mission, which turned out to be historic and iconic. At that point in time, back in 1968, 69, it was a job for us. It was way early at the beginning of my career, but that job turned out to be of such historic proportion that I'm gratified for that. So based on all of that, let's begin the presentation. First, I'll give you a little background and some history of the Apollo 11 mission in particular and space program in general. Then we'll discuss a little bit of the numbers and statistics of the Apollo 11. Then I believe probably the most exciting part of my presentation is that you will have a step-by-step journey of the Apollo 11. So where we will go through each phase of the mission, and I'll give you my perspective on it. Then we'll discuss the benefits of the Apollo program, and then a little bit about the future of the space exploration, which is getting more and more exciting by the day. And finally, we'll have some time for questions and answers. So that's the agenda. Next. Okay, so the first slide, just a little bit about those two pictures that you're seeing. The one on the right is President Kennedy, who got the whole program going actively. In 1962, as you can see, he gave a famous speech where he challenged the US nation and NASA to design a program where we can land a human being on the moon and bring them back safely. And by the end of the decade, that was the big challenge. So that was like 7.5 years to get the entire mission done. So he not only inspired, but he also funded the program. So not just the words, but he funded the program and he set up the mechanism and the infrastructure to make sure that our goal was met. On the left-hand side, you're looking at the 3 astronauts of Apollo 11. On the extreme left is Buzz Aldrin. In the center is Neil Armstrong. And on the right is Michael Collins. They became the most famous, but I can assure you there were dozens of other astronauts right behind them who also were trained for exactly the same kind of mission for future Apollo flights. And also there were backup crews in case something happened to them. But these three individuals, of course, were historic, and they were very courageous, very brave in what they did. They knew the chances they were taking, they knew the risk, but they were extremely well trained, extremely well qualified. They all were test pilots in the US Air Force with a tremendous record. So the entire effort began when 1957, Russia put out a satellite called Sputnik, and it was very simple. The Sputnik satellite went up in the Earth orbit, and just one orbit, and it came back. But that, and after that, in 1960, I believe, Russia also sent one astronaut, Yuri Gagarin, in the space. Now, those events really shocked us because at that time, back in late 50s and early 60s, there was a Cold War going on between the US and Russia, and we had to win that Cold War because it had tremendous global implications. So President Kennedy realized that, and then that's when he put the space program in action. NASA was a pretty small agency at that time, and he expanded the mission of NASA to pursue the space program, including the Apollo, and there were quite a few prior programs, which I'll mention briefly later. I want to mention the Southern California companies right here in the Orange County and LA County. They played major role in the space program and Apollo mission specifically. The next bullets talk about teamwork, management, and can-do attitude. Now, I wish I had enough words to describe the environment back in those days, early 60s and throughout 1960s. But in the entire NASA organization, and not just the NASA itself, but all the private companies which worked with NASA, there was a tremendous amount of teamwork and the management. By management, I mean the management who defined the objectives, they defined the roles. Everybody knew what they had to do. There was a can-do attitude. There was no looking back. We all knew that these were the deadlines and this is the mission, had to be done. And there was absolutely no doubt. Sure, there was a lot of nervousness, a lot of anxiousness, but we all knew what the mission was and what had to be done and in what time frame. Now, one fact I want to mention about this entire Apollo mission is that it required 100% reliability, meaning it had to happen. We had to go to the moon, do the experiments there, and come back safely back on Earth. And failure was not an option. Sure, the program had provisions for aborting the program in case something didn't go right, but that was just part of the program. But the failure was not even thought about. So everything that everyone did required 100% quality. And that's something that's really amazing when you think back that all this happened 52 years ago, when the technology is not what we have, the entire environment is not what we have today. So think back 52 years ago and keep that in mind when all the events happen. So next slide, please. Now this, I won't go through each of the numbers, but you can see that some of these numbers are amazing. Thinking back in 1960s, early parts of 1960s. And the picture on the right-hand side is the famous first step for the mankind on the lunar surface. That's Armstrong's footprint or shoe print. And that is one of the iconic pictures. So I thought we'd include that. So a couple of numbers I want to dwell on it a little bit. That Apollo 11 was the first of 7 lunar landing projects. There were actually 6 lunar landings. Apollo 13, unfortunately, didn't make it because there was an explosion in one of the modules. So Apollo 13 had to be aborted, and it came back safely to the Earth. Now, Apollo 13 is a story by itself. I won't talk much about it because that's a tremendous example of bravery, courage, planning, and the sheer guts of the 3 astronauts, specifically Jim Lovell, who commanded the Apollo 13. There was a movie about it, and some of you might have seen it. So that's something to remember. So there were 6 landings. So 12 human beings have walked on the lunar surface. Apollo 11 being the first one. The other number I want to bring your attention to is there were 400,000 men and women who worked on the Apollo mission at NASA, and even more on the private companies. Now, private companies played a key role, NASA being the overall manager, coordinator, and funder. But the private companies, and many of them right here in Southern California, they worked just as hard, as smart with NASA to make the things happen. Out of that, there were 200,000 engineers, technicians, scientists. And of that, about 3,000 in Houston, where I worked, 2,000 in Cape Canaveral in Florida, and the rest in the other NASA centers. Now, I mentioned Houston and Cape Canaveral, Florida specifically, because they were the 2 key NASA centers during the real-time operation of the Apollo 11 mission. And Cape Canaveral was key in launching the Saturn V rocket, which put the Apollo 11 capsule in orbit. But after the launch, then Houston takes over and took over. And Houston managed the entire mission all the way to splashdown and recovery and even quarantine. So these are the 2 key NASA centers. Now, all the other NASA centers and private companies, they made their contribution in building the capsules, in building the hardware, electronics, even the nuts and bolts, which had to be designed and built specifically to Apollo requirements. And then the rest of the people, another 200,000, were support staff. Now, we don't realize, but the support staff, including the administration people, they played a key role in those days in fulfilling the final mission. The other number I want to briefly mention is you might have heard that there are only about 30 seconds of fuel remaining. And I'll discuss more of that later when we talk about the lunar landing. But that was a very key number to remember. It was approximately 30, it could be 28 or thereabout. So Armstrong and Aldrin spent about 21 hours and a little bit more on the moon. And they collected 48 pounds of moon rocks. And after they came back, they spent 21 days in quarantine because nobody knew what kind of germs they would bring from the moon. Luckily, it turned out that there was nothing that was major, that was harmful, but that quarantine was still required. One last number I want to mention quickly. The iPhone that you are carrying in your hand today has approximately 100,000 times more computing power than the computer that was on board of the Apollo 11. Just think about that for a minute. That gives you a tremendous insight into how the technology has advanced. Not only that, also makes you think how 52 years ago they accomplished what they did with minimum computing power. So it's a really amazing numbers to think about. And finally, I want to bring to your attention that so far, as of today, US is the only nation to land astronauts on the moon and bring them back safely. Not once, not twice, 6 times. And I believe any other nation will not be able to do that in a long, long time, at least not in my lifetime. So that's something to be proud of. And also that poses a challenge for us for the future. Next slide, please. So this is the step-by-step going through all the phases of the Apollo mission. And look at the graphic on your right-hand side. Let me just briefly give you an overview of the graphic, then we'll talk about each of the 12 phases of the Apollo 11 mission. I say Apollo 11, but that's applicable to all the Apollo missions. The one on the bottom, the picture of moon on the bottom, that's like going to the moon. All the arrows are the trajectories which take astronauts from the moon, Earth to the moon on the right-hand side, lower part. And then the upper part of the picture shows moon to Earth. So that's the return journey. And all the arrows point to all the orbits and trajectories back to the Earth. So with that in mind, first let's talk about the launch. Now you've seen the pictures of launch from Cape Canaveral, Florida. That's probably the most exciting event of the entire mission, where you can see the Saturn V rocket taking off with huge power, flames, and all the support structure just collapsing and the rocket taking off. Now remember, the capsules, the command module or CSM, the lunar module, they're sitting on the top of the rocket. And the rocket takes off, and that's a sight that's absolutely amazing. In fact, people go visit Cape Canaveral days ahead of time. They find a nice place to park their RV, and they wait for the launch. So that's a very important phase of the mission. One thing that is not known, that pre-launch, there is a huge amount of activities because companies have to build the rocket, build the structure, build the engine, and they assemble the entire assembly, and then they bring that back. They put that assembly on a vehicle and drive them slowly to the launch site. And that takes enormous amount of technology and engineering and planning. So with that, let's say the launch has happened, and then we go up in the Earth orbit. As you can see, there is a circular orbit, and then the orbit gets expanded into elliptical orbit. And that just before the trans-lunar trajectory is taken. Just before step number 2, what happens is the rockets are fired at the right precise moment with the right precise force. Now, how do you know what the right moment is and the right forces? Now, this is where the onboard computers come into the picture. The astronauts receive a lot of data from Houston Mission Control. All data are current, real time. They're given to the astronauts. And the astronauts that will key in the data, not all of it, but some important data, they'll key in manually into the onboard computer. And then the computer will take over, and the onboard computer will know when to fire the rockets, at what force. And today, with our current technology, none of this manual effort will be required. But this was, again, 52 years ago, when a lot of these things had to be done manually. Okay, so once the rockets are fired at the right moment with the right force, then you are in the TLI, the trans-lunar trajectory. So that's when you are on your way to the moon, and you're gradually moving out of the Earth influence, Earth sphere of influence. And you can see that long arrow down where it shows you that you're on your way to the moon. Now, number 3 is the lunar orbit insertion. Now, this is another very tricky trajectory calculation. Now, this calculation of trajectory and rockets firing, it's a very precise and very complex, involved calculations. And we had some research lab, primarily MIT, who played a key role, and other labs around the nation who were involved in figuring out exactly what the equations were and what data were and how to program those. So all these were programmed in their computers in the research lab here. And then they will provide the real-time data through Houston Mission Control to the astronauts. And then they will put then they will control the onboard computers. Then computer will decide, when to do number 3, which is when and at what angle should we enter the lunar orbit. Now remember, that has to be extremely precise to make sure that we catch the moon orbit at the right time so that we can land on the moon at the right time, because everything has to be timed perfectly, because we do not have unlimited amount of fuel. The fuel is limited. So we have to make sure that we enter the lunar orbit, we land on the moon, and we still have enough fuel left to come back. So all these calculations are so complex. But again, we had our own research lab, MIT being the leading one, and quite a few other labs and private companies as well, who have their own research organizations, AT&T, IBM, and numerous others. All like here in Orange County, as I mentioned, we had McDonnell, Douglas Aircraft, North American, Rockwell Technologies, Raytheon, and there were hundreds of small businesses right here in Orange County, LA County, and all through the nation who contributed to all these complex characteristics of the entire mission. Okay, so we are on number 3. We are in the lunar orbit. Now, the next critical phase is the separation of CSM and LM. Now, CSM is where Michael Collins will stay, and LM, the lunar module, is where Armstrong and Aldrin will separate from CSM, and then they will begin their journey down on the lunar surface. So the separation is another key phase. I keep using the word key and important, but all the phases are important. So I don't know what other words to use except to say each one of these phases was key in the entire success of the mission. So once the CSM and LM were separated, CSM kept orbiting the moon, and Michael Collins was there. He was like a pickup taxi. He will keep orbiting and wait for the lunar module to come back from the moon, and he'll pick them up and bring them back safely to Earth. Okay. So number 5, now the lunar module descent has begun. Once again, the rockets have been fired at the right time, with the right force, with the right amount of fuel left, all done computerized. So now the descent has begun. And I have a video that I would like to present at that time. Now, I will not say anything because the video has the last 4 minutes of the actual descent, and it has all the captions on it, so I'll let you read it. And just focus right on the screen. And I hope you get the feeling, the exciting feeling that you get that you're about to make history. You're about to land on the moon in about 4 or 5 minutes, and just keep that in mind and just watch the video. And then we'll come back and talk about it. Okay.
Correction on that velocity, now reading 760 feet per second.
It's the P-64. Good. Roger.
Fido says we're go, altitude 9,200 feet.
830, you're looking great.
Descent rate 129 feet per second.
We copy. Eagle, you're looking great. Coming up 9 minutes.
We're now in the approach phase, everything looking good. Altitude 5,200 feet.
Manual attitude control is good. Copy.
Altitude 4,200.
You're go for landing, over. Roger, understand. Go for landing. 3,000 feet. Copy. Alarm. 1201. 1201. Roger, 1201 alarm. We're go. Same type. We're go. 2,000 feet. 2,000 feet. Into the ag. 47 degrees. Roger. 47 degrees. Eagle looking great. Your go.
Altitude 1,600. 1,400 feet, still looking very good.
Roger, 1202, we copy it. 35 degrees. 35 degrees. 750, coming down to 23. 700 feet, 21 down. 33 degrees. 100 feet, down at 19. 540 feet, down at 30. Down at 15. At 400 feet, down at 9. Skate forward. 1050 feet, down at 4. 30 and a half down. They're tagged on horizontal velocity. 300 feet, down 3.5. 47 forward. Put up. And 1.5 down. 70. Epic shadow out there. 50 down at 2.5. 19 forward. Altitude, velocity light. 3.5 down. 220 feet. 13 forward. 11 forward, coming down nicely. 200 feet. 4.5 down. 5.5 down. 160 feet. 6.5 down. 5.5 down. 9 forward. Good. 120 feet. 100 feet. 3.5 down. 9 forward. 5%. On any bike? 75 feet. Guys looking good. Down a half. 6 forward. 60 seconds. Lights on. 6, Down 2.5. Forward. Forward. 40 feet down, 2.5. Picking up some dust. 30 feet, 2.5 down. Straight shadow. 4 forward. 4 forward. Drift into the right a little. 6, down 1/2. 30 seconds forward. Okay. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. APA at a descent. Road control both auto. Descent engine command override off. Engine arm off. 413 is in. We copy you down, Eagle. Griffin, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
So, okay, so there it is. Eagle has landed. So what you just saw was the history in the making. So every time I watch that video, especially the last few minutes, it really gives me goosebumps because it was amazing. So just one thing I want to mention, if I may bring myself in the picture here, the simulator which our team worked on was designed to do just that, is to train the astronauts in landing on the lunar surface, especially the last couple of thousand feet. And there were all kinds of scenarios built into that simulation, including the one which happened where Armstrong took over manually the last few seconds and landed the lunar module in the space in the place which was on the other side of the crater. If you notice, if Armstrong had not taken over, the lunar module might have landed in the crater. So he guided manually over the crater and on the other side near a boulder. Because if you land in a crater, then the liftoff will be impossible and they would be stuck there forever. So just think for a minute. Armstrong brought all his flying skills, his courage, and his judgment in making that decision and making sure that the lunar module has landed safely in the right place, such that it has enough fuel remaining and that they are able to lift up. So that's number 6. Now, number 7 is a lunar walk, and that's where the famous sentence of one small step for mankind, one small step for man, one giant step for mankind. So that statement was made. So Armstrong and Aldrin, they conducted several scientific experiments while they were on the lunar surface. They walked around, they took pictures, and now it was time to go home. So number 9 is the lunar module liftoff and ascent. Now let's focus on the graphic on the right-hand side and the upper part of the picture, where you see the journey back from moon to Earth. And you can see all the arrows pointing back to Earth. And once again, the orbit around the moon, lunar orbit, it gradually expands to the point where the computers think that, okay, this is the right time to do the, to go back to the lunar trajectory. So So number 10 is the next step after is to rendezvous with the CSM. Now remember, CSM, Michael Collins, is still orbiting, waiting for the lunar module to come back. And so now the rendezvous is taking place where the CSM and LM are docking. Now, this seems like a small step, but we had simulators which would simulate just this one operation, like how to dock. It required tremendous amount of training, coordination between the lunar module and the command service module. And of course, there were computers behind it, the onboard computer on lunar module and computers on the CSM. They all had to coordinate. But docking the two modules in the lunar orbit at the right time, the right way, will ensure that the LM and CSM together will come back to Earth. So that was another key phase of the entire mission. So now the rendezvous has taken place. The two modules are together. The three astronauts are together. And now the journey back to the Earth has begun. So that's the phase number 11. It's called trans-Earth insertion. And as you can see from the arrow on the top, that's a long journey back. And once again, it required very precise firing of the appropriate rockets at the appropriate time, such that you get out safely and easily from the lunar orbit and then on your way to the Earth orbit. And once again, all this has to be targeted, very complex calculations, and I have no idea how they compute the calculations, but I know that there were scientists and engineers who did all that work at MIT and a lot of other labs. So they fed all the data, the real time, to the astronauts and into the computer so that this trans-Earth insertion trajectory happened. So now we are back on our journey to Earth. And as you can see in the picture, once again, at the right point in time, the CSM-LM inserted back into the Earth's atmosphere. And once again, it had to happen at the right time and the right angle, because if angle is not right, then excessive heat would be generated and the modules had could just burn and crash. So there's so many scenarios that were hard to imagine that could have happened, but none of that happened thanks to the work by those 400,000 people who work for NASA and all the support organizations, all the private companies and small businesses. So all that has happened. Now we are back orbiting the Earth. And now at the right point in time, we do the splashdown and recovery. So you might have seen a lot of pictures of how the modules came down and splashed down in the Pacific. Now, one last thing about teamwork. We talk about all kinds of teams, but there's one key team of people who are standing by in the Pacific Ocean in ships and small boats. Their mission is to go pick up the modules and the astronauts, bring them back safely to the ship. Now, this sounds easy, but they were in constant touch with Houston, so they know where the splashdown will occur and how much time they have. And they also were prepared. You might have seen movies where as soon as they locate the module, they speed down there, they put the floats around it, and they try to stabilize the module, because remember, the astronauts were out in the space. They were in this very cramped, in a small space. They haven't walked in I don't know how many days, quite a few days. So their sense of balance is off. They have into moon gravity. Now they're back to the Earth gravity. So a lot of adjustments have to be made. So all these tasks are handled by the splashdown and recovery team. So, so now we can go to the next slide. This picture I put in just to give you an idea what Earthrise looks like. This picture was taken from the lunar orbit. You can see the moon, but more importantly, you see the Earth rising. Now, over here on Earth, we talk about moonrise, we talk about sunrise, we see them every day. But think, if you're on the lunar surface, you see Earthrise. So this is a tremendous picture. And first time we, back 52 years ago, we on the Earth saw what Earthrise looked like. Okay. And moving on, just a few benefits of the Apollo 11 program. Now, there are numerous benefits. I only have listed a few that are of interest, and I'll talk briefly about them. But the most important thing is that first sentence. I'll give you a second to read that. That was a quote by Eugene Cernan, who was the last man to walk on the moon. He was one of the astronauts. And what he said is literally true. What you saw, what President Kennedy envisioned was what we are experiencing today in 21st century, all the technology and all the benefits. And I think that one sentence captures all the benefits that we have derived from the mission called Apollo and space program in general. On the left-hand side, a couple of pictures. The one on the left is Aldrin, and he is in one of the capsules. I'm not sure which one. On the right-hand side is Neil Armstrong. And on the bottom, you have Buzz Aldrin saluting the US flag with lunar module in the back. That picture was taken by Neil Armstrong. The one benefit I want to mention of the Apollo 11 program, and it's kind of intangible, that the first one, the environmental consciousness. When people all around the world, when they saw this picture, which is on the right-hand side, the picture of Earth, that picture you might have seen, it's called the marble. That's the first time we humans on Earth realized that, hey, this is how our Earth looks like. It looks so fragile, so beautiful, that we have to do something to keep that in mind and make sure that we preserve the Earth as we inherit it. And that put in place this entire movement of environmental consciousness. So that's an intangible benefit, but that one picture, I think, has done wonders for the entire movement of environmental consciousness and a lot of things that have transpired since then. Our consumer technology has benefited tremendously, and the digital flight technology has experienced tremendous amount of benefits. Like, for example, the commercial airplanes, including the jumbo jet, supersonic transport, military aircraft, and Mars program, which we'll talk briefly about a little bit later, and the concept of project manager, and this is management. And these are just some examples that I could think of. And the bottom line is that the kind of technology that we have today, all the benefits that we have derived over the last 52 years from the Apollo program are to the benefit of the humankind. And it's, believe me, back 52 years ago, this was all just a dream and all in the minds of scientists and engineers. No one had an idea what kind of technological benefits we'll have today in our normal day-to-day life. So I think as we experience our lifestyle, we just want to think about this periodically, and especially the benefits for the future generations. Okay, next slide, please. So, okay. So just brief discussion about the future of the space exploration. Let me talk briefly about the two pictures. The one on the left-hand bottom corner, that's the splashdown and recovery phase. That's where the lunar module is being taken care of by our splashdown team in Pacific Ocean. And the picture on the right-hand side, that's the three astronauts, Neil Armstrong on the left, Aldrin in the middle, Michael Collins on the right, and their wives. Their children were also there, but they are not in the picture. In this specific picture, the three astronauts are in a specially designed trailer. They're in quarantine. They're in quarantine for 21 days. And this is as close to their husbands as they could come, the three astronaut wives and their families. So that's an interesting picture. They look happy. They have accomplished something that will go down in the history forever. So, but they deserve all the accolade that they get because of sheer bravery and the courage, because they all knew when they took on the assignment that they may not come back. But they were focused on the mission. They knew that they had a team of 400,000 people who were backing them, and they had complete confidence in all of us who work on the space program. They had confidence in all of us that we have done our job right, and then they'll accomplish their mission successfully. So with that, let me just talk briefly about the future. One big benefit early in 70s we experienced was the flight technology. And now, looking ahead, we are going to have commercial space flights. And I put the word NASA in there. Now, I want to mention that NASA is the agency who is coordinating the future commercial space flight, but private companies are making huge contributions. So it's a public-private partnership, which is the key to our system. No other country has that kind of coordination of public-private partnership as far as the space program is concerned. We have the infrastructure, and we have the partnership, and we have the talent, we have the labs, we have the research centers, and we just have the disciplined, technological, skilled people. So with all that in mind, you know about SpaceX, Virgin Galactic, and Blue Origin. These are the three leading companies who are working with NASA. I'm sure there are a lot of other smaller ones, but I just wanted to mention these three because they are farthest ahead. Now, these companies are focusing primarily on rockets, but there's more to rockets than space exploration. There's the command and control, there's the sciences, all kinds of sciences, biological sciences, astrological sciences, and so on. So all that research is being done in the background by our the research centers. Now, this is a good point in time for me to bring up JPL, which is in our own backyard. JPL has been leading force in research after Apollo, especially now in Mars program. They are the leading NASA centers. And once again, they are working with several private US companies. So looking ahead, JPL will play a key role, and you all know all about the Mars Perseverance and what's happening. So that's just the beginning. Now, another exciting thing I want to mention right now is that in 2024 timeframe, our objective is to land first woman on the moon. How exciting will that be? That mission is called Artemis. Now, you probably know Artemis was a twin sister of Apollo in Greek mythology. So that name is so appropriate. And I can't wait to see the first woman on the moon. That will be such a tremendous, another historic moment. And it's going to happen fairly quickly, fairly soon, before we go to Mars and Jupiter and beyond. And if you extend your imagination even more, there'll be human settlement in space. And there's a lot of research on that going on right now in the background. We don't hear much about it. It's in very early phases, but take it from me, it's there. Just a little side note, there's a website called space.com. And if you ever have a chance to get on the website, periodically just look for all the things that are happening in the some of the things I'm talking about as to what's going to happen in future. Once again, I want to mention a couple of things. It might be repeating what I said, but I really do want to emphasize that the public-private partnership is a key to our success in the past, and it will be a key to our success in future. And our leadership and technology are going to be key. I think all the nations are looking to us to lead us, not just to moon, but to planets and beyond, even asteroids. Now, there's so many topics that we can talk about that I just want to kind of limit myself to what I have on the slide. But future is so exciting, and I'm happy to see now that the whole space topic has come back into our national conversation. After the Apollo 11 and after the Apollo project, beginning 1971, we changed our national priorities, and that was for the right reason, you know. But the conversation about space, the thoughts about space just disappeared, or it was relegated to very low priority. But now, over the last couple of years, you see it coming back. And that makes me personally very happy. I've seen the SpaceX and Virgin Galactic and Blue Origin launchings. We have seen the Mars launching and all that. So that gives me a tremendous amount of faith, and I hope that to you too, that we have a bright future in space with our leadership, and our next generation and the generation after that will have all the benefits and even more. So with that, I believe I'm done, or just a couple of pictures before I take your question and answers. The one on the left is the mission control, Houston mission control picture at the time when the Apollo 11 mission was ongoing. And these people who worked at the Houston mission control, they were smartest of the smartest engineers, not because of anything about them, but the kind of training and the skills that they had. And it was a very high pressure job where they had to make split second decision and convey those decisions to the astronauts on the in the space. Now, this was in Houston. Now, as I mentioned, I worked on Houston in the SimCom, called Simulator Complex. So Houston had two major components in their mission. One was the mission control, other were the simulators where the training was done. So this is the mission control, where I had never been there, and very few people had the opportunity to go there. But this picture is real time as the Apollo 11 was happening, and you can see the anxiousness, the calmness, and the confidence on their faces. On the right-hand side is another picture of the mission control. And this is obviously after the mission after the lunar module has landed. Everybody is happy, not as tense anymore. They're celebrating. So I thought these pictures were worth looking at. So that's the end of my talk. I hope you found that worth your time, and I hope you found that valuable. And keep your interest in space, pass that interest on to your kids, grandkids, and so on, because the future of space is bright, and our leadership will always be there.
Thank you,
Okay,
Joe.
thank you.
Really appreciate it. It's fascinating.
Thank you.
And so we've got a couple comments and questions I'll read for you. We've got a couple minutes for those who would have a question. Again, the chat function is available for you. We have Ralph said, awesome video, thank you. Martha hopes that the first woman on the moon will be Jessica Meyer. And she also commented that there was a marvelous accomplishment and memory that united our country. A couple questions. Neil Armstrong seems so calm as he landed the lunar module. Did he ever talk about those last 9 minutes?
Yeah, he has. I believe there are a lot of interviews that he gave. And if you do the search on the internet, you'll find articles, interviews, and even some YouTube videos. So yeah, he has talked about it, but he was such a low-key, low-profile individual. I have never seen him brag about anything. Yes, he talked about the calmness, but Aldrin was a little bit more extrovert. You've seen Aldrin probably talk with more emotions than Armstrong has. Now, but Armstrong was such an incredible person, and not only because of his skills, but even with his personality.
That's great. Did you have nicknames for the moon or astronauts or the landing module?
No, not that I am aware of now. People in the mission control, they probably had, I'm sure, in their normal conversation, they probably had some short, brief nicknames, but I'm not aware of it.
Christine has a question. Which booster was responsible for the launch? Was it the Atlas?
No, Saturn V.
Saturn V. Okay. Another question here was, do you all stay in touch with those that you were friends with at the time, and do you have reunions?
Unfortunately, no. That's a good question. See, once again, if you put yourself back 52 years ago, and soon after Apollo 11, the NASA had huge cutbacks, and a lot of people began to leave the space programs. And by 1972, NASA had practically was cut down to bare skeleton. So people that I worked with, people in Houston at that time, people in Cape Canaveral, in Huntsville, Alabama, and a lot of other places, they essentially left the aerospace industry and they went into other opportunities. And I have no contact with anybody. There are no reunions, at least in my sphere of influence. And also remember, people like me, they were in our 20s at that time. I was 26. The astronauts were mostly late 30s and early 40s. And many of them actually have passed away. And people who work with me, they are in fairly advanced age. They're in 80s, 90s, and there's some like one in late 70s. So I don't know of any ways how we can ever reestablish. There might be a few isolated incidents, but no, there has been no major reunions. So all this is in our memories, which will stay with us.
Thank you. So we're trying to, there's a participant, Martha, she wanted to say a couple words. So we're going to turn on her microphone.
Okay.
Let's see.
Am I unmuted now?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I can't remember the exact date, but it was probably somewhere in the middle 1960s when my husband was the director of the integration and test lab at TRW. Do you know that name, TRW?
Oh, yeah, I recognize TRW, obviously. They were one of the key private companies that I mentioned. Oh, sure, they were a very key part of the public-private partnership, yes.
Okay, so my husband was in charge of that laboratory, the integration and test lab. And we,
Oh, super.
our whole family had the privilege of going up to the rooftop of TRW in a big bubble that they had built to contain the LEM and to see it being put together.
Oh,
see
wow, wow.
Whole LEM being put together. Something my
Oh.
family will never forget. My kids and some small kid relatives who were there at that time visiting us.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, the integration and test lab, I don't know specifically, but I can visualize what their mission was. Yes.
Mhm. Did you know
That's
anybody personally up there? Did you know anybody personally up there?
No, not at TRW. No,
Okay.
you know, I was at the beginning of my career, and this was my second assignment in my first job in Houston. And at that time, our entire lives, not just mine, but people worked on it. It's just 24/7 work, and there was not much. There was a city called Clear Lake, Texas, just outside of Houston, where the NASA center was. So people worked there in the evening. They would go out in pizza parlors and, the usual evening family activities, and then next day back to work. So now the brief answer is that, no, I had never been to any other sites except Houston, and then later on to Ames Research Center in Mountain View. But I know about TRW and how important they were, and I'm so happy to talk to you about your husband. I mean, if he was a director of that center, he must be highly skilled and highly qualified person.
Right. Did they? I didn't realize that they actually brought the LEM back to this to us. The original LEM was brought back.
Original, yeah, it resides in one of the museums. I wish I knew.
The Smithsonian. We saw something in it's the Smithsonian that said it was the LEM, and I didn't realize it was the original LEM. I thought they had to leave that behind.
Yeah, you probably are right. Now, there are so many museums now. There are quite a few there are 5 other limbs which came after Apollo 11, and they all are placed in different museums and centers and NASA centers. So you probably are right that the original one is in Smithsonian.
Mhm.
Thank you, Martha. We're over time, so there's one more question, Joe. After liftoff from Earth, it looks like the ship went around Earth 1 to 2 times. Was that to slingshot the ship off the moon? Or why was that circled twice?
Yeah, it goes once around in a circular orbit. Then the next orbit expands into elliptical. And the reason is that they gradually try to get out of the Earth influence. And at the right time, they'll fire the rocket and then they'll escape the Earth orbit. That's what you mean by slingshot.
Mhm.
So yes, and that slingshot it sounds simple, but had to be precisely timed with the right force at the right time to escape the Earth so that they can enter the lunar orbit at the right time. Otherwise, they'll be lost in space.
Well, thank you very much, Joe. This was fascinating. If anybody has any follow-up questions, we can get answers to you. Appreciate your time. There were a lot of thank yous in the chat, very informative, and people enjoyed the session. So appreciate it. We will have a copy of this recording that we'll send out to everybody that joined us, and it will reside on our website as well. So appreciate your time. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you. You're welcome. And thank you for your time.